fundamental laws of physics are time irreversible. They go forward and backward. The Schrödinger wave equation works just as well describing from the current time slice into the future as it does describing from the current time slice to the past. Okay, so the fundamental laws of working of the universe are time symmetrical, and they're given probably by quantum mechanics. At least the theory of relativity is going to have to be reconciled with quantum mechanics, and most physicists think that in the reconciliation, it's quantum mechanics that's going to sort of wear the pants, as a philosopher once said.
Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, Boomer. Nice to be with you.
Well, you're in Scottsdale, or right outside of Scottsdale, Arizona today, but I wanted to kind of pick your brain about numerous topics. And first, I thought it would be interesting to go with a question that, for those who have read your books in the past, they may get the joke. But do you have a favorite biography?
Yes, I do, actually. It's a biography of George Orwell. And it's by Bernard Crick. And the reason I love the biography, aside from the subject matter and the care with which he wrote the biography, was that he begins by saying, it's a fallacy to think you'll ever get into the mind of the subject of your biography, and therefore I didn't even attempt
it. I was curious how you would answer that question, given some of the things you've written in the past, and so that's absolutely perfect. Alex or Dr. Rosenberg, which would you prefer?
Please, Alex.
Okay, Alex, you early in your career were studying the philosophy of economics, and then you made a transition. What caused you to first study the philosophy of economics, and what was the sort of impetus to move over?
Well, I began to write in the philosophy of economics because economics was a subject I avoided for political reasons, because I was a person of the left in college, and I postponed taking economics courses to the last semester of my senior year, and I walked into the class and discovered I loved it. But it was too late to go into economics. I was already committed to going to graduate school in philosophy. So fortunately, I went to a graduate school that had a better economics department than philosophy department, and I began sitting in on courses in economics, and I realized there was a whole completely undiscovered country there, which is the application of the philosophy of science to economics, the philosophy of economics. So I wrote a dissertation on that subject, and it was the first sort of move in the opening of a whole domain of inquiry. Now there are hundreds of books, 2 journals, a learned society. And of course, the strategic benefit of this choice of mine was there was no literature to review. And for the first 20 years, everybody had to start out by saying they're going to refute some article of mine. And when I went around the country giving talks about philosophy of economics, they said, oh, you can't be him, you're too young. Economists do not care, and never have, about what anybody thinks about their discipline except other economists. And after about 8 or 10 years of writing in the philosophy of economics without getting any attention from economists, I became sufficiently frustrated to notice that biologists had a completely different attitude towards the philosophy of biology. They were as much consumers as they were sellers of information for us philosophers. And so I was particularly interested in the impact of molecular biology on the subject and its relation to evolutionary theory. So I began to work in that area, and I got a couple of fellowships at Guggenheim and ACLS that let me go back to graduate school as a graduate student in molecular biology. And that's how I shifted. And I continued to do molecular philosophy of biology for the next 20 years with increasing interest on the part of biologists, and in an area of considerable intellectual and scientific ferment, molecular biology, until the financial crisis of 2010. And suddenly everybody from the Queen of England down was beginning to ask the questions that I had been asking about economics when I first started in the early 70s. And suddenly my work in that area was rediscovered. And I've been doing a fair amount of philosophy of economics ever since. But that's sort of the trajectory.
All right, because I almost want to have a whole separate conversation with you on the philosophy of economics, because that is a personal interest of mine, and I think it's something we could pick up at another time. Where does scientism come into the picture here? Where does your thoughts, your original thinking about scientism, or I shouldn't use the term thoughts, given some of the things we're going to discuss today. But where does scientism come into the picture in that overall path?
A famous biologist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, said nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. And he was literally correct. And of course, he meant Darwinian natural selection as the mechanism or process whereby evolution proceeds. The more I came to grips with Darwinian natural selection, the more I saw how it provided a metaphysical framework for understanding everything in nature beyond what physics and chemistry tell us. And then, because of my interest in reductionism, I began to think so hard about how evolutionary theory and Darwinian mechanisms in particular relate to the rest of the mechanisms of physics and chemistry. And having figured what I think is the answer to that question out, I began to see that I now had a way of looking at answers to all of the perennial problems in philosophy, or at any rate, many of them. The answers are disobliging. My view, scientism, another word for scientism is disenchanted naturalism. That is to say, having a naturalistic view of the nature of reality.
How do you feel about Wikipedia describing you as a naturalist then?
That's perfectly okay.
Okay.
In fact, I am a naturalist. And the difference between me and other naturalists is I'm inclined to say that they are optimistic naturalists, and I'm a disenchanted naturalist. And what that means is the optimistic naturalist thinks that naturalism can save a great deal of what Wilfrid Sellers called the manifest image, our common sense, everyday picture of reality. And I think that naturalism requires that we have to jettison, let go of most of those features of our picture of everyday reality. And substitute for that science. And that's why I'm perfectly happy to accept the word scientism, to try to take it away from detractors the way LBGT people have taken queer away from detractors.
Okay. So there are a few things I want to unpack there when it comes to some of the things that we have to let go when it comes to how we would normally concept reality. But why do you think, I guess before we even get into that discussion, why do you think the conversation around atheism is much more like an accusation rather than a discussion in general?
Oh, you know the old joke that two things we don't discuss around the dinner table are politics and religion.
Or your first date, right?
Yeah, maybe. Certainly on your first date. But religion is a touchy subject, and people think that owing to the fraught character of religious disputes, which eventuate in wars of various kinds and have had a baleful effect on humanity for at least 10,000 years, that it's a subject we shouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. And atheism is the strident insistence on touching that subject and condemning all religions as equally baseless. So it's easy for those of all religions to stitch together a coalition to oppose atheism, because whatever it is they disagree on, at least they agree on the condemnation of atheism. So it's also an idea that since mistakenly it is held that ethics is somehow grounded in or justified or enforced by religion, that therefore atheists are somehow or other untrustworthy. Don't leave them with the children or let them have access to your family silverware because they lack a moral compass. And I think that, ever since the Marxian expression of endorsement of atheism, established power has tarred atheism with the brush of that political movement as well.
Okay, so we have a number of, I guess, confounding factors that are working against the broader discussion around atheism. But perhaps what I loved about your book, The Atheist Guide to Reality, which is very much, I would say, not necessarily a direct discussion on atheism, but rather picking apart some of those ideas that we need to let go of. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to go through a couple of those ideas and how scientism actually helps us let go of them. And the first one I want to start with is just kind of the development of the universe. And I guess it's a fractal that's going to flow through on all levels here, but is there a purpose in the development of the universe, intelligent design? Would love to hear you unpack that.
So you're right that that book, The Atheist Guide to Reality of mine, doesn't contain any arguments in favor of atheism. It simply operates on the premise that if science is what made you an atheist, here are the other things that science should lead you to endorse. And the first of them is the purposelessness of the universe. Now, purpose was driven from physical science by Newton in 1680. There's no scope in physics for ends, goals, objectives, purposes, telos, whatever fancy word you may use to describe it. And once Darwin made the biological domain into a compartment of the physical domain, he effectively expunged purpose from that domain as well. Now, he did it by showing that all appearance of purpose, all appearance of adaptation in the universe is the result of a purely causal process of blind variation and environmental filtration to entirely passive, purely mechanistic causal processes. And by banishing purpose from the biological domain, he enabled us to see that it's a universe that there's no scope for purpose in. Now, the last sort of domain in which we're still using the language of purpose is human behavior and the way the brain works.
Oh, I'm going to get there. I want to get there in a little bit. I've got a few things.
But I'm assuming that the brain is the mind is the brain, and the brain is a physical system. And since there are no purposes in the physical domain, there are no purposes in the brain.
Okay, so if we don't mind, I want to kind of start at the beginning here, and perhaps if you can set up and conceptualize here for people the current science as it stands for how the universe developed, because I think that will actually help frame the discussion of randomness a little bit better. And so when it comes to the universe and how it developed, do you mind going into a little bit about what we understand perhaps from the quantum physics side of things too?
So I'm not an expert in quantum physics. Ask my friend Sean Carroll. But for our purposes, all we need to know, I think, is that the fundamental laws of physics are time irreversible. They go forward and backward. The Schrödinger wave equation works just as well, describing from the current time slice into the future as it does describing from the current time slice to the past. Okay, so the fundamental laws of working of the universe are time symmetrical, and they're given probably by quantum mechanics. At least the theory of relativity is going to have to be reconciled with quantum mechanics, and most physicists think that in the reconciliation, it's quantum mechanics that's going to sort of wear the pants, as a philosopher once said. So that's the fundamental basement level of reality, nothing but fermions and bosons acting in accordance with the laws of quantum mechanics. Now, when you get to the aggregation of matter, even very soon after the beginning of the Big Bang, you've got the operation of the second law of thermodynamics, the statement that almost certainly, with high probability, entropy is always increasing. The universe started out at extremely low entropy, high heat, very compact distribution of matter, and it has been spreading out ever since in such a way as to almost always increase entropy. And the almost always is an expression of objective probability. The objective probabilities are that entropy increases. That's the second law, and it's the only time asymmetrical law in physics. Now, fast forward to the biological domain and to the process of blind variation and natural selection that generates the appearance of organized adaptive systems. Okay, those systems have emerged improbably, but permissibly in accordance with the probabilistic second law of thermodynamics. And those systems persist and expand in the universe by eating up much, much more energy than they produce. Mm-hmm. So they continue to honor, to confirm the second law of thermodynamics, which tells us that entropy is always increasing, energy is always being wasted, and the universe is always being made more disorganized. And our biological systems are among those systems which most effectively and efficiently waste energy. Just think about reproduction and how wasteful it is, a way of producing from two sexually reproducing creatures to more sexually reproducing creatures. But if we start out from the basement reality of physics and work up to the point at which processes begin to look asymmetrical, and those are certainly the biological processes. Evolution is an asymmetrical causal chain in the universe. The only possible way that chain could exist is if it were the result of the operation of the second law of thermodynamics. Is that enough of a sort of a basement level?
That's very that's very, very thorough. And I was, I guess, in a way, and maybe this is almost breaking it down to too simplified here. But as I was reading your book and going through your book, there's this sort of almost Monte Carlo simulation, if you will, going on continuously. And perhaps I'm using the wrong analogy, that the universe is constantly running these different simulations as to what will work and what won't. And then just out of one chance, the universe has, or the multiverse, or whatever you want to call it, forgive my language here. Again, I'm not a quantum physicist either, but it spits out these random things that seem to work. And if I'm simple, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's the right description, except I wouldn't use the word simulations, because all of these experiments are real. They're going on all the time. Okay, and some of them eventuate in universes that exist for a millisecond, and some for a year, and ours probably for 100 billion years. And even within our 100 billion year long universe, there are going to be continuing cases of the random distribution of molecules moving in one way or another and producing what look like locally adaptive, far from equilibrium systems.
And those locally adaptive systems, some case, people would oftentimes refer to these as laws of nature, or even there's a book that I have over here called The Computational Beauty of Nature. And those repetitive patterns, those fractals that we see, are just a product of ultimately pure randomness. Do I have that right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So this is, again, a beautiful way to set up this discussion. And I want to kind of now go into a little bit about the human, and I probably shouldn't use the term about when it comes to
reading too carefully.
when it comes to some of your work here. But one of the aspects of the show that is a common theme throughout episodes is this idea of health and human performance. And oftentimes when you work with successful people, there's this, you come to find that a lot of what gets in their way is the thoughts in their head. And can we dive in a little bit from your scientism perspective? Thoughts, what are they? What aren't they?
So, I have a very extreme view about the nature of conscious states and what the philosopher calls intentionality. Intentionality is the feature of thought that it has content, that it contains sentences, that when we think in some kind of vehicle that expresses what written and spoken language uses sentences to express content. So if I think that Berlin is the capital of Germany, then I'm having a thought, a belief whose content is Berlin is the capital of Germany. Now, if the mind is the brain, and I don't see any alternative to that view, then it's got to be the case that the thought that Berlin is the capital of Germany is somewhere inscribed in the neural circuitry of my brain. But we already know enough about how the neural circuitry operates, especially in the midbrain, the hippocampus of humans and primates and indeed other mammals, to know that there's nothing in there that is anything like the inscription in a language of thought of sentences. Okay, there's no code that we could use to decode the neural circuitry of the brain the way we can decode linear B or Egyptian hieroglyphics and extract from those hieroglyphics the sentences in a language that we understand that they express. Similarly, there's no way we can decode out of the brain, out of the neurons, the neural circuitry, a set of sentences expressed in a language which we could translate into English or Urdu or Swahili, okay? And that means that the phenomenal experience, the conscious flow of introspective sensory awareness in our brain, which we think of as having content, doesn't. It can't, because it's a brain process. So contentful, intentional states of our mind and brain that have sentences inscribed in them is an illusion. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't sensations going through our conscious experience. There are, and we are organizing at least some of our behavior in a way that coordinates with those sensations going through our brain. And it's for the cognitive neuroscientist to help us understand the correlation between the sensory awareness that's going through our brain and our behaviors. And probably that correlation has a single joint cause in basic neural circuitry firing in our brain. But the idea that the mind, as we extract that notion from our own conscious experience, reflects the nature, the real nature of what's going on in our brains, that's an illusion.
Okay, so...
And hardly anybody believes that.
And I can ultimately see or understand why some people would come to question this, or even myself coming to question this, right? Because you have... let's just take, for example, like I'm having a thought, and what I'm calling a thought, arising in my mind right now, that I'm having this conversation here with Alex Rosenberg. And you mean to tell me that this thought is just merely, and I've had some experience in speaking with neuroscientists about this thought is really just neurons firing and producing some sort of pattern, which ultimately makes me, and what's the word that I use then if it's not think, that I'm talking to Alex Rosenberg, right?
All right, so here's a little thought experiment we can try, okay? I'm going to produce a noise, okay? And then I'm going to ask you whether that noise brings to your mind any intelligible English sentence, okay? And that's the first part of the experiment. And the second part of the experiment is I'm going to add some further information and then ask you to run the first experiment again and see if there's a difference. Okay, and now we're going to try to draw a conclusion from this. So here's the first experiment. I'm going to say something. I'm going to produce a string of phonemes, noises, and I'm going to ask you whether they call to your mind any intelligible English sentence. Okay, dogs, dog, dogs, dog, dogs.
Intelligible? No. No.
Okay, now, second part of the experiment. Okay, notice that dog can be a noun or a verb, okay? And now I'm going to say that first noise again. Dogs, dogs, dog, dog, dogs.
There's pieces that are coming together.
No, but now think about it again. Dogs, 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 dog, dog, dogs. What that means is dogs that chase or harass other dogs also harass still further dogs. Okay? And now it's a perfectly sensible English sentence, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What's the difference between the phenomenal experience that went through your head the first time you heard that same phoneme or similar dogs and dog, right, 6 times, and the second time? Only a further association, only a picture of dogs chewing on dogs.
Yeah.
Here's another example, okay? Visiting relatives can be boring. Now, does that mean that it's boring to visit relatives, or does it mean that relatives who visit you are boring? Okay? The difference between those two strings of phonemes, okay, is just another picture in your head, right? Which you've constructed. Or take cows, cows, cow, cow, cows. That's just like dogs, dog, dogs, dog, dogs, dog, dogs, dog, dogs. Okay. You understand it now because you know that to cow somebody is a verb and to cow is a noun. Now, let's not make too much heavy weather out of this. It's a simple experiment that shows you that you should be suspicious about what the intentional content, the sentences that are contained in your sensory conscious awareness consist in. Because if it turns out that to say they consist in something in one sentence is simply to have another set of sensory awarenesses, okay, then we've just postponed the problem of what the content of your sensory awareness really is. Okay. And if that turns out to go on forever or in a circle, we have no real understanding of what the content of conscious thought is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it might turn out that it's an illusion. And it's not an illusion that makes us into zombies. It's not an illusion that makes us into creatures who cannot cope intelligently and intelligently with our world. It's just the way we understand how we do that has got to be given to us by neuroscience, not by our introspective awareness.
And you mentioned in the book several times introspection in particular, but the way I kind of took this also, at least from a health perspective, is, your thoughts are not you. And of course, that can also be free for a lot of people that have a lot of mental health ailments, if they're able to work their way around that concept that the thoughts are not them, and so therefore the voices inside their head are just a manifestation of pockets of neurons that are firing, right? Am I too far off base there? Or?
No, the point is we can't take our own internal, introspective, deliberative, conscious states as more indicative of what's really going on in us than we can take the proprioceptive sensations that our body sends to us as signals of what's really going on in us. So you stub your toe, and you stub your toe, and you immediately infer that your pain is in your toe. Now it's not in your toe; it's in your brain. Okay, right? Because the toe has sent pain signals, and those signals aren't pains themselves, to the part of your brain where the sensory awareness of unpleasant sensation is produced. Okay, and we have to be as sophisticated and as skeptical and as wary about treating our introspective awareness as infallible, okay, as we have become about treating our sensory awareness of condition and states of our body as being the right guide to our physical health. The pain and unpleasantness that goes along with vigorous physical exercise is not a sign to stop.
There's a lot we can get on with that one just alone. I'm curious, and this is now kind of bridging to our next topic here, but what's your opinion on the self-help industry, Alex? Because I imagine a person who's questioning the purpose-driven life is quite skeptical about what is being put out there these days.
Yeah, it's entrepreneurs making money on the gullibility of the public. Was it P.T. Barnum who said, no one ever lost money underestimating the intelligence of the American people? Well, it's going to be true of all people. People have an wishful thinking and a search for simple answers and the desire to improve the quality of their lives that will drive them to try almost anything. And there are enough people around willing to satisfy their desire to try almost anything to make the self-help industry is it the third column of books in the New York Times bestseller list? There's the bestsellers, the paper, the online bestsellers, and then there's the self-help books, right? I mean, and the same self-help book gets published every 2 or 3 years.
Of
with
course.
the same set of fatuous advice, and typically is bought by the person who bought the previous version of it a few years ago. We ought to know by now that none of these panaceas are ever going to work, and the only thing that will work is hard science.
All right. So, and we're collecting our data points on the self-help side, right? Because as you said, there's a repetitive cycle in self-help where the same books come out every 3 or 4 years. Maybe somebody takes some clever spin on it. They have a really good social media person with them. And so that spin becomes viral. And then that's the new trend for the next 6 to 9 months before there's a...
But it goes all the way back. It goes back, what, 100 years? Norman Vincent Peale, How to Win Friends and Influence People, or Dale Carnegie, or Dr. Coué, Every Day in Every Way I'm Getting Better and Better. This was a craze of 1921, you know? And my history doesn't go back further than that, but it's at least 100 years that these kind of fatuous ways of exploiting people's credulity have made people rich.
So, in the spirit of how to win friends, let's go down the aspect of purpose here and unpacking that. Is one of the I can't remember who the Chinese poet was, but there is a Chinese poem that loosely translated as "Life is purposeless and meaningless," and when I saw that and then read your book, it was sort of a marriage in many ways, and a few light bulbs went off. Let's talk about purpose and how can one dissect purpose, because so many people are trying to grab onto something in this world. And is there anything to grab on to?
Well, let's grab onto Darwin. We're the result of 3,500,000,000 years of selection for a suite of traits, okay, that brought us within the last 200,000 years from the bottom to the top of the food chain on the African savanna, and then made us the dominant predator of the entire planet. And the process of selection operated not just on our physiognomy, indeed, mainly it operated not on our physiognomy or our physique, but on our brains, okay? The 2 pounds in our crania that consume 20% of the energy that we consume every day, and which enabled us to discover collaboration and cooperation. And by the use of that device, begin to, as I said, climb our way up the food chain on the African savanna, and then spread across the entire world, disposing of previous homonyms who had antedated us in the rest of the world, the Homo erectus, the Neanderthal, the Decimovians, and the Homo florens. So right now, as you and I talk, our own brains and our own emotions and our own personalities and our own satisfactions and dissatisfactions and our own behavioral pursuits, right, are the result of this continual shaping of an organism in such a way as to become the top predator. And one of the things that almost certainly it produced in us is continual dissatisfaction, continual need to conquer the next challenge, to somehow respond to the environment in ways that will enhance our reproductive success. Now, we're not thinking in those terms. Okay, we're thinking in terms of, I want to live forever or leave my mark or die happy or something like that. And I can't because I'm still dissatisfied and I haven't gotten everything I need yet, because natural selection has produced creatures of our kind with our suite of dispositions and attitudes, including this never sated feeling of dissatisfaction. Once we realize that, is there any chance that we can either harness it or govern it, or at any rate distract ourselves from its inevitable tendency to make us dissatisfied? I hope the answer to that question is yes, and I think that the answer has to be given by pharmacology.
Okay. Pharmacology is interesting, but I guess from the, and I could spend a little bit on pharmacology, but I want to go back to something you said. And so this entire insatiability of all of our desires and everything can't be satiated, or there is no that continued striving, if you will, is purely driven by basically the modes of survival and reproduction, and it's selected for because that striving for is what allows us to survive and reproduce. Do I have that?
Something like that. Although we have to remember always that, as Darwin pointed out, all biological traits come on a nice bell-shaped curve, and there's a mean, and there's a lot of people distributed along the first and second
quartile.
Moment away from the mean. And of course, the psychopaths are at one end and Mother Teresa is at the other end. And of course, there are going to be a lot of people whose particular package of psychological traits, right, enables them to, by and large, be satisfied with life. Okay, and these are typically people who are happy and underachievers. And then they're going to be the overachievers who are typically dissatisfied with life. And they're going to be really a small number of those who are overachievers and satisfied with life. If you're lucky, you're one of those. Okay. And if you're not, and you're so distracted by the way in which your psychology has been put together to make you always dissatisfied, well, there are some presumable steps that you can take, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy plus Prozac or some other pharmacological cocktail to prevent the suite of traits with which you have been endowed by a long process of evolution for reproductive fitness from making you unhappy.
I was going to ask this question.
Certainly, we were not selected for being happy.
So in this spirit of pharmacological cocktails, and I was going to ask this question later, but since you brought it up now, psychedelics, how do you look at these when it comes to particularly these types of questions? And there's still one level that I would like to unpack with you after this, free will. But how do you view psychedelics as helping people tackle these types of questions?
I have no idea. I've never tried acid or mushrooms. The few times I've tried hash or cannabis, it's had zero effect on me. So I am completely on the sidelines, an observer of these matters. Now, from the point of view of the neuroscience of the matter, it's fair to assume that these things work on some people, and they work on some people by rearranging the neural circuitry of the brain. And presumably, cognitive neuroscience and neurology can begin to titrate these substances in such a way as to figure out how they work on the brain, and then maybe also use them as therapeutic devices. Certainly, when I was a college student, Timothy Leary was riding high, and it was, drop out and get high. And now, 60 years later, right, there are both psychiatrists and neurologists who are undertaking controlled experiments with psychedelics to treat various kinds of disorders. And I have no doubt that at least something therapeutically useful will come from this research. But at this point, we don't have the slightest idea what.
Okay. So I'll ask you in a year or two, once the third or FDA approval of MDMA comes through.
Right, exactly.
And
it'll
I want
probably
to
happen in Holland before it happens at,
well,
the FDA is so risk averse.
well, I would say here we have a slightly more progressive approach to how they look at these things. With that being said, they usually take, or my experience, and when I looked at psychedelics, when they originally criminalized them, the US did it and then everybody else followed. And so maybe it's going to be the reverse that allows people to get access to some of these therapeutic molecules, which I do have some experience with these, hence the question. And they've been, and I can't remember how you use the phrase in your book, but they've allowed me to tackle some of those larger questions and being able to confront them in a less scary manner. Or as you say, I didn't need Prozac when I came across them. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I want to go a level, maybe not a level down, but perhaps going a different path here. Free will. We've seen this large theme around natural selection and just randomness in particular. Free will, do we have it? And if you can lay out just sort of the arguments for, as well as in the book, how you kind of unpack that as well.
So the arguments for are my introspective awareness assures me that
introspection's your favorite thing.
Well, so let's look at this. I put my finger up and I ask myself the question, given the whole history of the universe up till now and the deterministic laws of nature, including the Schrodinger wave equation, which is a totally deterministic law, given the whole history of the universe and the starting point, together with these deterministic laws, is it entirely up to me whether I, in the next 5 seconds, point this finger to the left or to the right? And when I consider this question introspectively, when I ask myself this question silently and with my eyes closed, I say, of course it's up to me. I can point it that way or I can point it that way, right? I have free will, surely, with respect to this trivial choice. And I'm going to point it that way and that way, right? And that's the hard way, because your natural instinct is to point it in the way your wrist bends. All right, so introspection tells me I have the choice, right? Should I believe introspection? Well, I have about 400 years of the history of science increasingly showing that the entire universe is deterministic, where that means that if I have the right theory and the right description of the time slice, I can predict with 100% reliability, or in the case of contemporary quantum mechanics, 12 decimal places, the future and the past of all physical systems. I am a physical system. Therefore, I am as subject to the deterministic laws of nature as anything else is, okay? And the idea that I had a choice, a real choice that I could have done otherwise when I pointed my finger in that direction, is incompatible with all the evidence that supports the structure of physical, chemical, and biological theory from Newton to the present. So I have a choice. I can either accept the evidence of introspective awareness or the evidence from the history of science. Those people who think that we still have real free will, as opposed to the soft determinists who are just fudging, are expressing their preference for introspection as trumping the evidence of science. Those of us who insist that we don't have free will are simply holding that physics and chemistry and all the rest of science trumps my introspective psychological awareness of free will. Does that make sense?
It does. And one of the questions, and I don't know if you've ever been asked this before, maybe you have, but I hope you have, but from the scientific or from the non-scientific standpoint, maybe somebody from the intelligent design community has come to you and asked this question, where it's, does the second law of thermodynamics, as well as all that we just talked about, randomness and Darwinian natural selection, are those evidences of intelligent design? Meaning that could somebody have put those rules in place to govern the whole universe? And how would you look at that?
Among the different theological views, there's theism and pantheism and polytheism, and then there's deism. Mm-hmm. Deism is a theological doctrine, sometimes attributed to the founding fathers as motivating their desire to see the separation of church and state. Deism is the thesis that the universe and everything in it was created by an all-powerful, all-knowing deity, and having set the universe up, starting conditions and the laws of nature, he turned his back on it and has left it alone ever since, so that there's no object of petitionary prayer or seeking divine intervention, because he's no longer interested in the project. Okay, so deism is this idea that the universe is intelligible to us, that there are laws of nature, that they were put in place by a powerful agency, but he is otherwise indifferent to the outcome of the operation of these laws on the starting point that he arranged. Now, it seems to me that that idea has so little content difference from atheism that I'm not really prepared to debate it. It does seem to me that the success of science hitherto suggests that, at least to the scientific method, the nature of reality is intelligible. And by intelligible, I just mean we figured out the laws of nature, or we are on the way to figuring out the laws of nature. Why they are the way they are and not some other way, that's a fatuous question that I don't think that there's any answer to. Certainly there's no intelligence that makes them intelligible to itself or to us. And why is it the inverse square law instead of the inverse cube law of gravitation or similar alternatives? So I just don't see that the hypothesis that you invited me to consider even counts as an interesting scientific thought about the nature of reality. You want me to call myself a deist? I don't care. Right?
More curious if anybody has asked you the question. So we've unpacked today thoughts, we've unpacked today purpose, free will, and the universe. And at the end of this, somebody's sitting here and saying, so now what? How do I behave in the world? And so I want to talk a little bit about nihilism and what you phrase so nicely as nice nihilism. Maybe that's the way we go into it, but if we've now just realized that life is indeed purposeless, meaningless, and doesn't have a pattern, how do you interact?
Patterns given by
natural selection, yeah, laws of nature, and second law of thermodynamics. And so in this case, how do people behave? And do you mind just talking to us a little bit about nice nihilism?
So nice nihilism.
I should say, it's funny. I was like nihilism, and most of the people listening to this, their exposure is probably The Big Lebowski, right? Where they saw nihilists all over the place. Well, with Jeff Bridges, of course, and probably little exposure other than that. So nice nihilism, as I am now corrected.
So nihilism is the doctrine that among all the competing ethical theories and commitments to ethical value, none of them is right. And nihilism, I think, is a doctrine that is pretty much required if you're a scientistic person. If you believe that the only justification for any moral theory, any set of moral norms, utilitarianism, Christianity, Kant's theory of right action, that the only justification for any set of beliefs can be given by science. Well, we've known since David Hume that science, the description of the way the world is, cannot be the basis for any conclusion about the way the world ought to be, and that therefore all of these moral theories, which are theories about what ought to be the case, okay, are unwarranted from the point of view of science. And if science is the only basis on which to warrant anything, then they're unwarranted, period. Okay, so that's the nihilist part, right? And the nice part is natural selection has produced us as cooperative, collaborative creatures, because we never would have gotten up above the bottom of the food chain on the African savannah without those two particular devices, cooperating with one another, altruism, sharing, reciprocation, and all of the other behavioral traits that our moral theories inculcate in us, okay, and which harnessed together with emotions like shame and guilt and happiness and love, produce organisms like us, who in the majority on the medium of the bell-shaped curve are morally worthy people who can reliably turn their backs on one another without being worried about being stabbed in the back, or leave our wallet in the back of a taxi and have good reason to think it'll be returned to us. Okay, natural selection has produced us as generally moral people, because that was the adaptive strategy, okay, that humanity in the individual and in the group required in order to find itself where it is astride the planet as the top predator. And so nice nihilism is the doctrine that most of us are okay, most of us behave in ways that are satisfying to the emotional responses of others, okay? And that it's only the psychopaths on one end of the extreme and the Mother Teresas on the other end of the extreme who are significantly abnormal. And fortunately, we only have to protect ourselves against the psychopaths and prevent the Mother Teresas from being exploited. Now, the question is, I think, the last question is, well, so how do I live my life? Right?
Exactly. So we're walking about day to day, and what is the approach? Is it just everything is equal weight, or nothing matters and everything matters?
No, for most of us, I hate to say this, the thought has only just come to me. Remember that you're not old enough to remember that Disney Pinocchio, in which Jiminy Cricket sings, "Always let your conscience be your guide."
Right? I think I've seen it, but please go on.
So, maybe it turns out that for us scientific folk, okay, this is not such a bad mantra, because for most normal people, standard deviation was the word I was thinking of before, who are one standard deviation away from the mean when it comes to human cooperative and collaborative behavior, okay, we're driven to that behavior by our moral emotions, which have been harnessed together with norms by our upbringing, and our culture is as much the product of Darwinian process of selection as anything else, okay? For most of us, we not only have to let our feelings be our guides, okay, but in so doing, we operate successfully in the world. We make friends, we avoid offending people, we don't violate the law, we raise our children well and treat our parents properly, okay? And we're fortunate that we're within one standard deviation on either side of the mean, okay? And the problems arise only for the people at the extreme ends. And those people need some kind of therapeutic intervention.
How do you look at planning and setting goals and these types of things in the context of no free will, no purpose, and is it all about just, to kind of quote a semi-Buddhist saying, it may not have been a Buddhist thing, but is it all about just living in the moment?
It's not about living in the moment. No, I think we're creatures that live much more forward in time than the moment. People who live in the moment generally find that most of their moments are unhappy and unsatisfying, especially the ones after the sort of prime period in which they're living in the moment, acting on their immediate wants and tastes. How it is that creatures like us contrive to live lives that involve long-term trajectories of a sort that look like they involve identification of purposes and then systematically organizing and marching in the direction of satisfying those purposes. Okay, that's something that, again, clinical psychology and cognitive neuroscience are ultimately going to have to illuminate for us, because the off-the-shelf, purpose-driven life explanation of how we contrive to do this has to be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Has to be wrong because we know from much more fundamental science that the future can't cause the past, okay? And that the ends and goals to which our behavior seems to be adapted and aimed can't be the actual shapers of that behavior. It could only be some kind of variation and selection operating in our brains just like it operates in our environment. You know, this idea, this Darwinian idea, Dan Dennett made this wonderful observation that the Darwinian mechanism gets instantiated in so many different ways. In the Darwinian way with genes, in the Skinnerian way with operant conditioning, in the brain with Hebb's law about circuits that fire together,
Wire together, fire together.
Fire together, right. This whole architecture of functional organization built through the process of Darwinian variation is a really deep idea that Edman, the famous neuroscientist, a cognitive Darwinist, first advanced quite a long time ago. And it just seems to me there isn't any other game in town for understanding these higher, apparently purposive activities of humans or of other primates and higher mammals.
And I guess since we already unpacked the future here, going into the past, and I know a lot of this conversation has been about your book, The Atheist Guide to Reality, and a lot of your other work as well. But you're looking at history. Is there any utility in history at all? Because I mean, from a finance perspective, and that's just the world I come from, you know, back testing, people use back testing and models all the time for trading, and they use history as a reference. But in this conversation, it would seem that history has very little utility in how we would live our daily lives.
Well, now you've turned the page onto another book and a big subject. So I wrote a sequel to The Atheist's Guide to Reality called How History Gets Things Wrong, the Neuroscience of Our Addiction to Stories. And I won't bother you with the whole thesis, but stories are things we tell ourselves and that are psychologically satisfying, but really have almost no predictive value. And the book is devoted to explaining why we use stories, the theory of mind, to interact with one another and to satisfy the itch of curiosity, even when it doesn't have a payoff and predictive confirmation. And there's a lot of neuroscience in that book, and it's a sequel to The Atheist Guide to Reality insofar as I took chapter 8, which people really scratched their heads about, and decided I needed to expound the insights of that chapter at much greater length. But now, when we go as far as, say, doing in-sample studies and then using them out of sample, as in finance, that's not using stories from the past to guide our future. Okay, Henry Kissinger uses stories from the past to guide our future. You know, his future predictions about how countries will react to American diplomacy. That's fallacious. But using game theory and data to do that might work out very nicely. It happens. I'm writing a new book right now on economic theory, and given the actual structure of economic theory, I'm very pessimistic about it's actually improving in any way as a predictive science, although I think it's absolutely indispensable for the designing of institutions that will protect ourselves against, you know, Hume's, Nave, and Hobbes's fool, those who haven't internalized the niceness that I talked about before. But with the right scientific tools, you're going to be as able to make reasonable predictive claims about the future of human behavior as we've been able to make in biology about the future behavior of infrahuman animals. Because basically it's the same kind of science. Now, our biological science isn't predictively super reliable in the way chemistry and physics are, but we have pretty good explanations of why. And similarly, we're going to be able to understand what the limitations on predicting human behavior, even in the financial markets, are going to be. But they won't be from storytelling, history.
This is perhaps a great place to pause this conversation, because I almost feel like I'm going to open up an entire another conversation with you because of your other book, and maybe even on philosophy of economics here at some point in the future. But Alex, this has been absolutely fascinating. I guess one or a couple of closing questions for you. What would you advise people? And this could be, I'm very curious how you answer this. What would you advise people if they wanted to live smarter, not harder?
I'm not in the business of advice. And, one of the problems in writing The Atheist Guide to Reality was the editor wanted an advice chapter at the end. And so I gave him one. And I've had a lot of grief ever since about it. And I'm about to teach a segment on naturalism in a course on the good life at Duke University. And I'm wrestling with this question about how to end my part of the course in addressing that question. And I guess the answer that I give is, if you're troubled, seek professional advice. But professional advice means advice that's driven by science, okay? Whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy or pharmacologically based interventions. Don't seek it from your pastor. Don't seek it from someone who tells you they've got the latest psychodynamic spin on Freud. Don't seek it from your political guru who tells you that once we've established the socialist commonwealth, that you'll be happy, right? Science is the only resource we have to address all the real questions we have. And if science can't address a question, it's a pseudo question.
It's beautiful. Alex, where can people find out more about you if they wanted to dig a little deeper?
Well, I have a website, but it's devoted to advertising my novels. I'm the author of 4 historical novels that have nothing to do with scientism and nothing to do with philosophy and everything to do with surviving in the brutal short 20th century, which starts in 1914 and ends in 1989. So that's one place. And the other place is my university website, where you can get a list of the books I've written, or just, I found that the Wikipedia article is pretty accurate. I don't like it, right? For various reasons, but I can't gainsay what it says about my work and about my trajectory in life.
Alex, thank you for coming on the show today and spending so much time with us. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope we can do it soon, either in Geneva or North Carolina or one of the places that you travel. It's there's so many levels that I could take this to, but thank you again.
Thank you for asking such penetrating questions.